at 11:47 in the evening on December 18, 1944. Second Lieutenant James Edward Hollister crouched in a frozen foxhole 800 meters from the German border and realized that every tactical principle he had learned at Fort Benning was about to become completely useless. The radio in his hand crackled with the voice of Captain Morrison from battalion headquarters, 3 kilometers behind the line, and the message was simple. 120 German soldiers had just punched through the gap between Charlie and Dog companies, and Hollister's understrength platoon of 18 men was the only thing standing between that breakthrough force and the complete collapse of the entire regimental flank. Morrison's final words were delivered with the flat affect of a man reading a death sentence: "Hold until dawn or the whole sector folds." Then the radio went silent, leaving nothing but the whistle of wind through bare trees and the distant sound of German voices agonizing in the darkness. Hollister was 27 years old, a former high school mathematics teacher from a small town outside Pittsburgh who had volunteered 3 days after Pearl Harbor and spent 6 months in combat since Omaha Beach. He had survived the hedgerows of Normandy, where every field was a potential killing ground, the street fighting in St. Lay where snipers turned every window into a death trap, and the nightmare of the Hurricane Forest where his company had been shredded from 190 men to 43 in 11 days of fighting through mud, mines, and artillery that turned centuries-old trees into splinters. He had watched his younger brother Michael die in Corentin with a German bullet through the throat, holding the 23-year-old's hand as blood bubbled from his mouth and his eyes went glassy with shock. Over that body, in the ruins of a French bakery that smelled of cordite and death, Hollister had made a promise that he would bring every man under his command home alive if it was in his power to do so. Now, staring at the dark tree line for 100 meters to his front where German voices were already audible in the winter night, barking orders in a language he had learned to recognize if not understand, he realized that keeping that promise would require him to do something that no manual, no instructor, and no officer candidate school lecture had ever prepared him for. He would have to lie, cheat, and deceive not just the enemy, but his own chain of command. The mathematics were brutal and simple, the kind of problem Hollister would have written on a chalkboard for his algebra students back in Pennsylvania, except this equation was written in blood and the solution determined who lived and who died. 18 men against 120 was a ratio of nearly 7 to 1. Standard doctrine, drilled into every officer at Fort Benning, held that an attacking force needed at least 3 to 1 superiority to overwhelm a prepared defense, which meant the Germans had more than double what they needed to annihilate Hollister's position and keep moving toward the vulnerable supply dumps and headquarters elements 3 kilometers behind the line. His platoon held a frontage of roughly 600 meters, which meant each man was responsible for covering over 30 meters of frozen ground, far too wide to establish interlocking fields of fire or mutual support. They had 2 Browning M1919 machine guns with barrels worn smooth from weeks of continuous use, 11 M1 Garand rifles, 3 M1 carbines that were notoriously unreliable in cold weather, 2 Browning automatic rifles, 16 fragmentation grenades, and exactly 9 anti-tank mines that were designed to stop panzers but were useless against infantry unless he got creative. Ammunition was critically low after 3 days of continuous contact without resupply. Each rifleman had fewer than 60 rounds, barely enough for 3 minutes of sustained fire. The machine guns had less than 500 rounds each when doctrine called for 2,000. And there was no resupply coming before dawn because every available truck was committed to moving fuel and ammunition to units engaged in heavier fighting 20 kilometers to the south. The ground was frozen hard enough to make digging additional positions impossible without jackhammers and explosives they did not have. And the temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that weapons were jamming from congealed oil. Men were losing sensation in their fingers even with gloves, and the wounded from earlier fighting were dying from exposure before blood loss could kill them. Hollister's position occupied a low ridgeline covered in skeletal trees that offered concealment but little cover, overlooking a shallow valley that the Germans would have to cross to reach the secondary defensive line. The tactical situation was clear. This was ground chosen not for its defensive strength but because it was the only place between the German breakthrough and disaster. It was a position you held because there was nowhere else to go, and you held it knowing that doctrine said you would fail. Hollister had 3 choices, each one worse than the last. He could order a fighting withdrawal, abandoning the position and falling back to the secondary line 1,500 meters to the rear. but that would leave the gap wide open and allow the German force to roll up the entire regiment from the flank, potentially collapsing the entire divisional sector and turning an ugly situation into a catastrophic breakthrough. He could stand and fight conventionally, spreading his men along the defensive line in a thin skirmish line and hoping to inflict enough casualties to make the Germans break off the attack. But the mathematics guaranteed his platoon would be overrun in minutes and wiped out to the last man without slowing the German advance by more than 10 or 15 minutes. Or he could try something that had never been taught at Fort Benning, never been tested in any training exercise, and would almost certainly result in a court-martial if it failed. He could make the Germans believe they were attacking into a much larger force, channel them into a carefully prepared kill zone using deception and misdirection, and use psychological manipulation to multiply his effective strength by a factor of 10. It was insane. It violated every principle of honest command and transparent communication with higher headquarters, and it was the only option that gave his men even a remote chance of surviving the next 2 hours. The question was not whether the plan would work, because Hollister had no idea if it would, but whether he was willing to accept responsibility for what would happen if it failed. He made the decision in less than 30 seconds, the way you make decisions in combat when hesitation kills more surely than enemy fire. Then he gathered his 3 squad leaders in the command foxhole and began explaining a plan that would require them to trust him completely. Lie to their own artillery about enemy positions and distances, manipulate the dead to deceive the living, and turn the frozen Belgian forest into a theater of systematic psychological warfare. Staff Sergeant Karl Dietrich, a 32-year-old German-American from Milwaukee, who spoke fluent German and had already proven invaluable as an interrogator and scout, listened to the plan with an expressionless face and then asked the question Hollister had been dreading. "Sir, are you asking us to lie on the radio to get artillery support inside the safety zone?" Hollister looked at the older man, a combat veteran with a silver star and 2 Purple Hearts, who had survived North Africa and Sicily before transferring to the European theater, and answered with a truth that felt like swallowing broken glass. "Yes, because if we do not, we are all dead and the entire flank collapses, and I would rather face a court-martial than explain to your wife why I let you die following regulation." Dietrich held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once and said, "Then we better make damn sure it works, because I do not want to get court-martialed and dead on the same day." The plan had 3 layers, each designed to exploit a different element of German tactical psychology and the specific circumstances of a night attack by troops who were operating in unfamiliar terrain. First, Hollister would create the illusion of a much larger defensive force by establishing fake positions using decoys and visual deception, using individual riflemen to simulate entire squads through coordinated fire patterns, and exploiting the darkness and limited visibility to make the Germans believe they were facing at least 2 or 3 platoons spread across a wide defensive front. Second, he would use carefully positioned obstacles, terrain manipulation, and visual cues to channel the attacking Germans away from his actual positions and into a predetermined approach route that looked like the path of least resistance but was actually a narrow killing ground where every weapon could be brought to bear simultaneously. Third, he would call in divisional artillery on coordinates that were dangerously close to his own men, far closer than regulations allowed or safety doctrine permitted. And he would deliberately misreport the range to enemy positions to convince the fire direction center to approve the mission without asking too many questions. If it worked, the Germans would walk into a trap that appeared to be a weakly held position hastily abandoned by demoralized defenders but was actually a death funnel covered by concentrated fire and high explosive shells. If it failed, his own artillery would likely kill half his platoon, the Germans would overrun what remained, and Hollister would spend the rest of his short life knowing he had murdered his own men with tactical arrogance and criminal deception. He started with the deception layer, which had to be completed before the Germans began their assault. Dietrich was given the job of establishing for fake positions along the tree line using every trick the platoon had learned in 6 months of combat. Helmets were mounted on sticks and positioned to simulate sentries, visible in silhouette against the slightly lighter sky but too far away for the Germans to realize they were decoys until they got close enough to be engaged. Overcoats were stuffed with leaves and pine branches to create man-shaped bundles that looked like sleeping soldiers, positioned near the fake sentry positions to suggest a defensive line that was undermanned and exhausted. Small fires were built with damp wood that produced visible smoke without creating enough light to reveal the positions as fakes. suggesting the presence of cold and desperate men trying to stay warm in violation of light discipline. Each fake position was placed exactly where German doctrine and tactical training would expect to find an American strongpoint, at the corners of the defensive line where it would anchor the flanks, on slight rises in terrain that offered good fields of observation, and near obvious approaches where defenders would naturally position themselves to cover likely avenues of attack. The real positions were pulled back 30 meters into deeper cover, invisible from the German line of approach, dug into the reverse slope of the ridgeline where they could not be seen until an attacker crested the high ground, and arranged in a staggered L shape that would allow overlapping fields of fire once the enemy entered the kill zone. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski, a 19-year-old farm kid from Iowa with an uncanny gift for mimicry and a natural talent for thinking like the enemy, was positioned with an M1 Garand and given the task of simulating an entire rifle squad by firing single shots from 4 different positions in rapid rotation. Hollister walked him through the technique step by step, explaining how he needed to fire 1 round from the first position, immediately move 10 meters to the second position while staying low and quiet, fire again after exactly 8 seconds, move to the third position, and repeat the pattern to create the impression of multiple shooters engaging targets from dispersed positions. 2 other riflemen, both veterans with enough experience to understand what Hollister was trying to achieve, were assigned the same task on opposite ends of the line. The effect, Hollister calculated based on his understanding of how German scouts reported contact, would make the Germans believe they were facing at least 30 to 40 defenders spread across a wide front in a conventional defensive posture, when in reality the actual firing positions were concentrated in a zone less than 100 meters wide that would become a crossfire kill zone once the trap was sprung. The 2 Browning machine guns were the key to the entire plan, the pivot on which everything else turned. Instead of placing them in the obvious positions where German doctrine would expect to find them, which would be the slight rises at either end of the defensive line with good fields of fire across the valley, Hollister ordered them and placed in defilade positions 40 meters behind the fake front line, dug into positions on the reverse slope where they were completely invisible from the German side but had clear lanes of fire across the kill zone at a shallow angle. The gunners, Corporal James Fisher and Private First Class Anthony Russo, were each given strict instructions that violated every instinct of a machine gunner. Do not fire until Hollister gave the signal by firing a red flare. Do not fire at targets of opportunity or at German scouts probing the position, and when they opened up, fire in short disciplined bursts of 5 to 7 rounds to conserve ammunition and avoid revealing their positions until the trap was fully sprung. Each gun was pre-registered on specific aiming stakes that Fisher and Russo drove into the frozen ground using bayonets and sheer stubbornness, with final protective fire lines that overlapped in the center of the kill zone to create a crossfire with no dead space. If the Germans entered that zone in any concentration, walking into the trap as Hollister hoped they would, the 2 guns would catch them in a crossfire from positions they could not see, firing from angles they would not expect, with nowhere to go and no time to react. The obstacles were improvised from whatever materials were available in a defensive position that had been hastily occupied 6 hours earlier. The 9 anti-tank mines, heavy disc-shaped charges designed to destroy the tracks and suspension of German panzers, were pulled from their original positions along the approach routes and were buried in a staggered line across the most obvious avenue of approach through the valley. Hollister ordered them placed shallow, only 6 inches deep instead of the regulation 12. Which meant that even the weight of a running man might trigger the pressure fuse and detonate the 7 kilograms of composition B explosive. It was a calculated risk, because the mines were not designed to be used this way and there was a real chance they would not function properly in the frozen ground. But Hollister was betting that the psychological effect of even 1 mine detonating would be worth the risk. Concertina wire that had been cut and abandoned during the previous day's fighting, left behind when another unit withdrew under pressure, was dragged into position by 4 men working in total silence and arranged in a loose V shape that appeared to be a gap in the defenses, a break in the wire that suggested hasty retreat or incompetent defensive preparation, but actually guided anyone passing through directly into the center of the kill zone like a funnel directing water into a drain. Fallen logs were positioned to create natural choke points that would slow an assault without being obvious enough to alert a careful enemy, forcing attacking troops to bunch up and lose their interval as they climbed over or went around the obstacles. The most disturbing part of the preparation, the element that made several of Hollister's men look at him with expressions he could not read, was the deliberate manipulation of corpses to enhance the deception. 3 German soldiers killed earlier that day during a brief firefight were deliberately moved from where they had fallen and positioned at locations that suggested a hasty American withdrawal, left behind in the panic of retreat. One body was placed near a fake position with its rifle lying a few meters away, suggesting an American defender who had been killed and left unrecovered. Another was positioned face down in the mud near the gap in the concertina wire, creating the impression of recent fighting and American casualties. The third was left sitting against a tree in a posture that could be mistaken from a distance as a wounded man waiting for evacuation. It was grim work, manipulating corpses to deceive the living, and Hollister felt something fundamental shift inside him as he supervised the placement. But he understood that psychological warfare required calculated brutality and a willingness to do things that would haunt him long after the shooting stopped. The Germans needed to believe the Americans had been routed and were no longer capable of organized resistance, that this position was the last desperate stand of a broken unit that could be swept aside with one determined assault. The most dangerous part of the plan, the element that kept Hollister's hands shaking as he worked through the details, was the artillery. He knew he needed heavy fire support to make up for his catastrophic lack of manpower, but the regulations were explicit and unambiguous. No fire missions closer than 400 meters to friendly positions without explicit approval from battalion command. And no fire missions inside 200 meters under any circumstances, unless it was a final protective fire in danger of being overrun. The kill zone he had prepared was only 150 meters from his actual defensive line, which meant the shells would be landing close enough that even a slight error in aim, a miscalculation of wind drift, or a short round caused by a defective powder charge would annihilate his own men with the same efficiency it destroyed the Germans. Standard doctrine also required him to report accurate coordinates and ranges when calling for fire support, both so the fire directions center could calculate safe trajectories and so higher command understood the actual tactical situation. Hollister needed to violate both of those regulations, and the line needed to be specific enough to be believable but vague enough to give him deniability if the plan went sideways and survivors started asking hard questions about who gave what orders. He rehearsed the radio call 3 times in his head before he would actually transmit it, knowing that his voice needed to sound stressed but not panicked, urgent but not desperate. Confident enough that the fire direction officer would trust his judgment but concerned enough that they would prioritize his mission over the dozen other requests flooding the battalion net. At 15 minutes past midnight on December 19th, the German attack began with the methodical precision of veterans who had done this hundreds of times before. Hollister heard them before he saw them, the crunch of boots on frozen ground that carried clearly in the cold night air, the metallic clink of equipment as men checked weapons and ammunition, the low voices of squad leaders organizing their men in the darkness, speaking in German phrases that Dietrich quietly translated from his position 3 meters away. Spread out, watch for mines, officers say the Americans are running. Through the pale moonlight filtering through broken clouds, Hollister could make out the dark shapes of infantry moving in a loose skirmish line, advancing cautiously toward the American positions with the tactical discipline that came from surviving the Eastern Front. They were moving in textbook fashion according to German doctrine, using whatever cover and concealment the terrain offered, maintaining 5-meter intervals between men to reduce vulnerability to artillery and automatic weapons, and sending scouts forward in pairs to probe for resistance and identify defensive positions. These were not green recruits pulled from depot battalions or second-rate garrison troops transferred from occupation duty. These were combat veterans who moved with the confidence of men who had broken British positions in North Africa, shattered Soviet defenses at Kharkov, and knew exactly what they were doing. Hollister watched through his binoculars and forced himself to wait, every muscle in his body tensed with the effort of not giving the order to fire. Every instinct screamed at him to open fire immediately, to hit them while they were still in the open and hadn't identified his actual positions, but he forced himself to hold and trust the plan. The deception only worked if the Germans committed fully to the attack, if they believed they were facing scattered resistance from a demoralized enemy and pushed forward into the kill zone without hesitation or caution. He watched as the lead German scouts, 2 men moving in practice coordination with one covering while the other advanced, reached the first fake position and paused. Through the binoculars, he could see them studying the helmet on the stick, the dying fire, the man-shaped bundle that was supposed to look like a sleeping soldier. One scout moved forward carefully, rifle raised, closing the distance to 10 meters. Then 5. Then he kicked the helmet, realized it was a fake, and shouted a warning in German that Dietrich translated in a whisper. Decoy position, they have abandoned this line. That was when Kowalski opened fire, following his instructions with the precision of a metronome. A single shot from 200 meters, the sharp crack of an M1 Garand that echoed across the frozen valley, fired from the leftmost position where Hollister had placed him. 8 seconds later, another shot rang out from a position 30 meters to the right, and then another from the center, and then back to the first position in a rhythm that suggested multiple shooters engaging targets with careful aimed fire. The effect was exactly what Hollister had calculated. The Germans hit the ground instantly, convinced they were taking fire from multiple positions across a wide front, and began returning fire at the muzzle flashes with the volume and intensity that suggested they believed they were facing significant resistance. Within seconds, the entire German line was shooting at shadows, pouring rifle and machine gun fire into the fake positions while Hollister's men remained silent and invisible in their actual positions 30 meters behind the decoys. Hollister could hear German voices shouting orders, could see muzzle flashes spreading across the German line as more troops joined the fight, and knew that the company commander was making his assessment based on incomplete information and reasonable assumptions. The Americans were defending from prepared positions. They had at least platoon strength spread across the ridgeline, and they could be overwhelmed with a single coordinated assault that would sweep through their positions before they could organize effective resistance. The German commander, convinced by everything he could see and hear that he was facing a thin defensive line that could be shattered with aggressive tactics, made the decision Hollister had been praying for. He ordered his entire force to fix bayonets and assault straight through the center. Hollister heard the order shouted in German across the valley, heard the response as squad leaders acknowledged and began organizing their men, and felt his heart hammering so hard he thought the Germans might hear it. This was the moment when the plan would either work or collapse into disaster. If the Germans split their force or tried to flank the position, the deception would fail and his concentrated defensive line would be vulnerable. If they were cautious and called for their own artillery support first, the fake positions would be destroyed and his actual positions potentially exposed. But if they committed to a frontal assault in the belief that speed and aggression would carry the day, they would walk straight into the trap. 120 German soldiers rose from cover and began moving forward at a run, screaming and firing from the hip in the classic Eastern Front assault tactic that had broken Soviet positions from Stalingrad to Kursk. They came on in a wave, bunching up as the terrain and obstacles funneled them into the approach routes that Hollister had left open, moving fast and loud with the conviction that overwhelming violence would shatter American resistance. They poured through the gap in the concertina wire exactly as Hollister had planned, naturally following the path of least resistance, funneling into the kill zone like water flowing downhill. The first anti-tank mine detonated when a German squad leader stepped directly on the pressure plate, and the explosion was catastrophic. 7 kilograms of composition B detonated with enough force to blow a crater 2 meters across in the frozen ground, and the Unteroffizier simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the blast, while two soldiers running 3 meters behind him were slammed to the ground with shrapnel wounds to their legs and torsos. The second mine went off 6 seconds later as troops tried to spread out away from the first explosion, and then the third, and the German assault wavered for just a moment as men realized they were running through a minefield and death could come from the ground itself without warning. But their momentum carried them forward, training and discipline and fear of stopping in the open pushing them into the killing ground. And within 20 seconds nearly 80 Germans were inside the kill zone, packed into an area less than 50 meters across with no cover and nowhere to go. Hollister grabbed the radio handset with hands that were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it, keyed the microphone, and transmitted the call he had rehearsed. His voice was tight with controlled fear, stress making it crack slightly on the keywords. As he reported enemy infantry massing at coordinates he read directly from his map with a flashlight that had red filters to preserve his night vision. Then he added the critical lie, speaking clearly so there would be no misunderstanding and no request for clarification. Range to target, 400 meters, troops in the open, request immediate fire mission. In reality, the Germans were less than 200 meters from his position, close enough that he could hear individual voices screaming orders and calling for medics. But the fire direction center at battalion headquarters 3 kilometers behind the line had no way to verify his report in the darkness and confusion. There was a pause that felt like an eternity. 10 seconds of silence while Hollister imagined a skeptical artillery officer checking his map and calculating trajectories and realizing that something did not add up. Then the radio crackled with the flat acknowledgement that meant the mission was approved. Shot out, time of flight 22 seconds, take cover. Hollister had less than half a minute before 6 105mm high-explosive shells traveling in a ballistic arc at supersonic speed would impact his target zone. He used 15 seconds to scream the order for his men to get down into their foxholes and cover their ears. Another 5 seconds to repeat the order because he knew some of them had not heard him over the sound of gunfire and explosions. And the remaining 2 seconds to drop into his own foxhole and press his hands over his ears hard enough to hurt. The first salvo of divisional artillery hit the kill zone at 27 minutes past midnight. Exactly 14 seconds after the German assault reached its maximum concentration with troops packed shoulder to shoulder trying to move through the obstacles and around the mine craters. The effect was beyond anything Hollister had imagined or hoped for, beyond anything that training exercises or after-action reports had prepared him to witness. 6 shells impacted within a 50-meter radius in a pattern that suggested either extraordinary luck or divine intervention, air bursting 5 meters above the packed German infantry with a sound that erased thought itself. The overpressure alone, the shock wave of compressed air moving faster than sound, killed 11 men outright without leaving a mark on their bodies, collapsing lungs and rupturing eardrums and stopping hearts through sheer physical force. The shrapnel, thousands of steel fragments moving at velocities that turned them into invisible blades, killed 23 more in the first 3 seconds, scything through the packed ranks like a harvesting machine cutting wheat. Men were shredded where they stood, torn apart by metal moving too fast to see, reduced from living human beings to unrecognizable wreckage in the space of a heartbeat. The concussion threw men 10 meters through the air as if they weighed nothing, slamming them into trees and frozen ground hard enough to shatter bones and rupture internal organs even if the shrapnel missed them entirely. Hollister felt the blast wave wash over his position even at 150 meters, a physical wall of pressure that made his vision blur and his teeth ache and his chest compress, as if a giant hand was squeezing him. Dirt and debris rained down on his foxhole, small stones and frozen clods of earth that pattered on his helmet like deadly hail. 2 of his own men were hit by shell fragments that traveled farther than the safety calculations predicted, high-velocity metal that arced through the air and found flesh even at distances that should have been safe. Private Marcus Webb took a piece of shrapnel the size of a man's thumb through the meat of his shoulder, punching through his field jacket and lodging against his scapula where it burned like a brand. Private First Class Eugene O'Malley lost 3 fingers on his left hand when a white-hot fragment sliced through his foxhole at an angle no one could have predicted, severing the digits so cleanly that for several seconds he simply stared at his hand in incomprehension before the pain and shock set in and he started screaming. Before the German survivors could recover, before the men who were still capable of conscious thought could process what had just happened and organize any kind of response, Hollister fired the red flare that was the signal for his machine guns to open fire. The 2 Browning M1919s opened up simultaneously from their concealed positions, firing in short, disciplined bursts exactly as Fisher and Russo had been trained, walking their fire across the kill zone from opposite angles in a pattern that created an inescapable crossfire. The overlapping fire caught the surviving Germans in a tactical situation that no amount of training or combat experience could overcome, trapped in an open kill zone with no cover, taking fire from positions they could not see, caught in a crossfire that made any direction of movement equally deadly. Men tried to run and were cut down by fire from angles they had not expected. Men tried to crawl and found that the machine guns were firing in grazing patterns that swept the ground at knee height, making prone movement as dangerous as running. Men tried to find cover behind the bodies of their dead comrades and discovered that the interlocking fire left no dead space, no safe ground, no place where the bullets could not find them. The riflemen added their fire with the methodical precision of men who understood that every shot had to count because ammunition was too scarce to waste on anything but killing. The Browning automatic rifles hammered away at clusters of Germans trying to organize a withdrawal or establish a base of fire to suppress the American position, breaking up any attempt at coordinated movement with short bursts that turned leadership into a death sentence. The entire engagement after the artillery strike lasted less than 4 minutes of sustained fire, 160 seconds of killing that felt both instantaneous and eternal. And when it ended, because there were no more targets visible in the kill zone, the landscape had been transformed into something from a nightmare. Bodies lay in windows and piles where the artillery had caught them in formation, twisted into postures that looked impossible for living flesh. Wounded men screamed in the darkness, calling for medics and mothers and God in voices that would echo in Hollister's memory for decades. Men stumbled in circles with their eardrums blown out and their vision gone, walking blindly through the carnage, unable to hear the warnings shouted by their surviving comrades. Hollister forced himself to watch through his binoculars, forced himself to count and assess because that was his job and his responsibility. And what he saw made him understand that he had just orchestrated something that would define him for the rest of his life, whether he wanted it to or not. The kill zone was a slaughterhouse, approximately 60 meters across and littered with evidence of what concentrated fire and careful planning could do to human beings who had walked into a trap. He called in a second artillery mission before his conscience could stop him, adjusting fire 50 meters to the rear to catch any Germans attempting an organized withdrawal and prevent them from regrouping for another attack. The Fire Direction Center approved without question this time, convinced by the success of the first mission that Hollister's coordinates were accurate and his tactical judgment sound. 3 more salvos fell over the next 6 minutes, interdicting the German withdrawal route and turning an orderly retreat into a rout where survival depended on individual initiative and luck rather than unit cohesion or tactical doctrine. By 41 minutes past midnight, 14 minutes after the assault had begun with 120 German soldiers advancing in disciplined formation, the firing had stopped because there was nothing left to shoot at. Of the 120 Germans who had entered the kill zone with confidence and aggression, fewer than 20 escaped back to their own lines capable of coherent action. 47 were confirmed dead by the count Hollister made at dawn when he could finally walk the battlefield, though that number did not include men who had been so thoroughly dismembered by artillery that counting them as individuals was impossible. 31 were wounded too badly to move under their own tower, left behind in the mud and cold when their surviving comrades withdrew, and they spent the night screaming for help that would not come until American medics reached them hours later. The remainder had either surrendered immediately by throwing down their weapons and raising their hands, or were wandering in shock through the forest, unable to remember their names or understand what had happened. Hollister's platoon had held the line with the loss of 2 men killed by shrapnel from the same artillery strike that devastated the Germans, and 5 wounded, 3 of them by their own supporting fires. By any objective military standard, it was a triumph, a tactical victory that would be studied and analyzed and held up as an example of what could be accomplished through careful planning and deception. By any human standard, it was a horror that would mark everyone who participated in it. The silence that followed was worse than the battle, more oppressive and haunting than the cacophony of gunfire and explosion. Hollister walked through his positions in the pre-dawn darkness, moving from foxhole to check on his men, and found them staring at him with expressions he could not read and was not sure he wanted to understand. Some looked at him with something like awe, the kind of expression you would give to someone who had just performed an impossible feat that defied belief. Others looked at him with something closer to fear, as if they had just realized that the quiet math teacher from Pennsylvania was capable of orchestrating mass slaughter with the precision of an equation. A few, including men he had served with since Normandy, would not meet his eyes at all, finding sudden interest in cleaning their weapons or checking their ammunition, or any task that did not require them to acknowledge his presence. The camaraderie and trust that had bound the platoon together through 6 months of combat felt fractured in ways Hollister could sense but not articulate. Staff Sergeant Dietrich approached him near the command foxhole as gray light began to seep into the eastern sky, and asked the question that Hollister had been dreading since the moment he transmitted the fire mission. "Did you lie about the range to get the artillery up?" Hollister looked at the older man for a long moment, calculating whether honesty or deflection was the right answer, then decided that Dietrich deserved the truth because he had trusted Hollister enough to help execute the plan. He nodded once, a small gesture that felt like signing a confession. Dietrich's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, some fundamental reassessment of the man he was looking at. He said nothing for several seconds, then turned and walked away without another word, and Hollister understood with absolute clarity that whatever trust and respect had existed between them had been fundamentally and perhaps irreparably altered. You could win a battle and still lose something that could never be recovered, a lesson they did not teach at Fort Benning. At 6:30 in the morning, as full daylight revealed the scope of what had happened during the night, Captain Morrison arrived with a relief platoon and a medic carrying supplies that were already too late for two of Hollister's men. Morrison was a career officer who had been in the Army since 1936, and he walked through the kill zone with Hollister in silence, counting bodies and documenting the carnage with a small notebook and a camera. When he finished, after 30 minutes of walking among the dead and listening to the sounds of wounded Germans being treated by American medics, he turned to Hollister with an expression that mixed genuine admiration and profound unease. The captain asked the obvious question, the one that would need to be answered for the after-action report and potentially for higher command. How exactly did 18 men manage to hold against overwhelming odds and inflict casualties at a ratio of better than 6-1? Hollister told him the truth without embellishment, deception using fake positions and coordinated fire to simulate larger forces, misdirection using obstacles and terrain to channel the enemy into a prepared kill zone, and artillery called in closer than regulations technically allowed in order to catch the Germans at maximum vulnerability. He described the anti-tank mines used against infantry, the corpses moved to suggest American casualties and hasty withdrawal, and the deliberate misreporting of range to ensure fire support approval. Morrison listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral, and when Hollister finished, he asked the question that would haunt the young lieutenant for the rest of his life. Would you do it again? Hollister thought about his dead brother Michael bleeding out in Corentin, about the promise he had made over that body to bring his men home alive if it was within his power. He thought about Private Webb with shrapnel in his shoulder and Private O'Malley missing 3 fingers and the 2 men who had died because his artillery calculation had been close but not perfect. He thought about the German soldiers who had walked into his trap and died screaming in the mud, men who probably had families and promises and reasons to want to survive just as compelling as his own. Then he answered with a truth that felt like swallowing ground glass. Yes, sir, I would do it again. Because the alternative was losing everyone and the flank collapsing and potentially hundreds more casualties. I would do it again because it worked. And in war the only unforgivable sin is failing when you could have succeeded. Morrison nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, then told Hollister something that explained more about the nature of command than any lecture at officer candidate school. There would be no official inquiry into the artillery coordinates or the methods used, as long as Hollister never spoke about the details publicly or put anything in writing that might raise uncomfortable questions. The victory was too important, the tactical situation had been too desperate, and the results were too effective for anyone in the chain of command to want to examine the means by which success had been achieved. Sometimes, Morrison said quietly, the Army needs plausible deniability more than it needs transparent accountability, and this was one of those times. The battle was recorded in the regimental after-action report as a successful defense against numerically superior enemy forces, with commendations noted for the platoon's courage under fire and Lieutenant Hollister's tactical leadership. He received a Silver Star for gallantry in action, presented at a ceremony 3 weeks later at a rear area headquarters where he stood at attention in a clean uniform and accepted the medal from a colonel he had never met while photographers documented the moment for the division newsletter. The citation praised his tactical brilliance, his calm under fire, and his inspirational leadership in circumstances of extreme difficulty. It said absolutely nothing about the lies he had told, the corpses he had moved, the regulations he had violated, or the calculated psychological deception that had made the victory possible. The official history was clean and heroic and completely sanitized of the moral ambiguity that had defined every decision he made that night. Hollister accepted the medal with a face like stone, said the required words of gratitude, and put the Silver Star in his pocket where it stayed until the war ended. He never wore it after his discharge in July of 1945, not once in the 56 years he lived after returning home. Hollister survived the remainder of the war without serious injury, fought through the final offensive to Germany, and was among the first American troops to cross the Rhine in March of 1945. He returned to Pennsylvania in July with an honorable discharge, an unspoken understanding that certain details of his service would never be discussed, and a determination to rebuild the quiet life that the war had interrupted. He went back to teaching mathematics at the same high school where he had worked before Pearl Harbor, standing in front of rooms full of students who could not possibly understand what it meant to reduce human life to variables in an equation where the wrong answer meant everyone dies. He married his college sweetheart Helen in October of 1946 in a small ceremony attended by family and a few friends, but notably none of his surviving platoon members, who had scattered to different corners of the country and perhaps wanted to forget as much as remember. He and Helen raised 3 children in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nobody asked too many questions about the war years, where he could pretend for long stretches that December 18, 1944, had never happened. He never joined the veterans of foreign wars or the American Legion, never attended unit reunions or division gatherings, and never spoke publicly about his combat service except in the vaguest terms. He avoided war movies and refused to watch television documentaries about the Battle of the Bulge even when his children wanted to learn about their father's war. For 53 years he maintained a silence about that night in the Belgian forest, carrying it alone because speaking about it would have required explaining moral complexities he was not sure he could articulate and moral compromises he was not sure anyone who had not been there could understand. Then in 1998, a military historian named Dr. Robert Kaplan, who was researching small unit actions during the Battle of the Bulge, tracked him down through pension records and asked him to be interviewed for an oral history project collecting first-person accounts from surviving veterans. Hollister was 79 years old by then, retired from teaching for 15 years, and his wife Helen had passed away 2 years earlier from cancer, leaving him alone in a house full of memories and silences that no longer needed to be kept. He agreed to the interview on one absolute condition: it would not be published or made public until after his death, so that he would never have to face questions or judgment from people who had not been there and could not possibly understand. Over 3 sessions in his living room, with a tape recorder running and Dr. Kaplan asking careful questions, Hollister described the night of December 18th in detail for the first time in 54 years. He talked about the mathematics of desperation, the brutal calculus that reduced human beings to numbers in tactical equations. He explained the psychology of deception, how understanding what the Germans expected to see allowed him to show them exactly what they wanted to believe. He described the moral weight of command decisions that saved American lives by violating every principle of honest warfare and transparent communication. He talked about the faces of his men after the battle, the way some of them had looked at him with expressions that made him feel less like a hero and more like someone who had done something fundamentally wrong even if it had been tactically necessary. He described the weight of the Silver Star sitting in his desk drawer for decades, a piece of metal he could not bring himself to wear because it represented a triumph that felt inseparable from dishonor. The historian asked him directly if he felt the deception was justified, and Hollister gave an answer that captured the moral complexity of a war fought by ordinary men in impossible circumstances better than any textbook or doctrinal manual. Justified is the wrong word, he said, because justification implies a clean choice between right and wrong, and that night there were no clean choices, only degrees of terrible. What I did was necessary, and necessary is not the same thing as right. It was effective, and effective is not the same thing as moral. It saved lives, and saving lives by lying about how you did it does not erase the lie. I have spent 54 years trying to determine whether I should be proud of that night or ashamed of it, and the only conclusion I have reached is that it can be both at the same time, that success and dishonor are not mutually exclusive, and that war forces you to make choices that cannot be evaluated using the moral frameworks that apply to normal life. I did what I believed I had to do. I kept my promise to bring my men home. And I have paid for that decision every day since with the knowledge that I am not the person I thought I was before that night. Hollister died in his sleep on March 15, 2001, at the age of 84, 3 years after giving his interview to Dr. Kaplan. His children found the Silver Star while going through his effects, stored in a small wooden box in his basement workshop, wrapped in tissue paper next to his discharge papers and a faded photograph of his platoon taken in Belgium in January of 1945. 18 faces stared out from that photograph, young men in dirty uniforms standing in the snow with weapons and exhaustion and the particular look that comes from having survived something that should have killed you. Written on the back in Hollister's precise handwriting was a single sentence: these men held the line. There was no mention of how they had held it, no reference to the deception, or the lies, or the artillery called danger close, or the moral compromises that had made survival possible. Just the bald statement of outcome, stripped of method and context and complexity, the way official histories record victory without examining its cost. The tactical innovation Hollister employed that night was never formally adopted into United States Army doctrine during his lifetime, but elements of it appeared in training manuals and tactical publications after the war under innocuous headings like economy of force operations, deception techniques, and psychological warfare application. The idea of using coordinated fire from dispersed positions to simulate larger units became a standard technique in defensive operations taught at Fort Benning and other infantry schools. The practice of calling artillery danger close to friendly positions was eventually codified with proper safeguards, communication protocols, and safety procedures after too many incidents of friendly fire made it clear that desperation tactics needed formal guidelines. The use of decoy positions and psychological manipulation of enemy decision-making became central to Cold War-era tactical thinking, incorporated into special forces training and unconventional warfare doctrine. None of these developments credited Hollister by name, because his after-action report had been deliberately vague about methods and his superiors had maintained plausible deniability about the details. But military historians who studied the engagement recognized the fingerprints of his improvisational genius in later doctrinal evolution. Dr. Kaplan published Hollister's oral history in 2003 as part of a larger collection of interviews with World War II veterans titled The Weight of Necessity: Combat Leadership and Moral Complexity. The chapter devoted to the December 18th engagement was called The Mathematics of Desperation, and it became one of the most widely cited accounts of small unit tactical innovation under impossible conditions. Military academies, including West Point, Fort Benning, and the Marine Corps University at Quantico used it as a case study in leadership ethics, creating seminar discussions and written exercises that debated whether Hollister's decisions represented admirable tactical flexibility or a dangerous precedent for dishonest command. There was no consensus among the military professionals who studied it, because the questions Hollister faced that night admitted no easy answers and no clean resolution. Some argued that deception was a legitimate weapon of war, no different in principle from the British dummy tanks and fake radio traffic used to deceive the Germans before D-Day, or the Soviet maskirovka that concealed defensive positions at Kursk. Others contended that lying to your own chain of command about danger close artillery crossed a moral line that no tactical success could justify, that it violated the trust between soldiers and officers that made coordinated action possible. War, as Hollister had discovered in that frozen Belgian forest, was not a problem that could be solved with mathematics alone. It required calculation, yes, but also intuition, deception, moral compromise, and the willingness to accept ambiguity as the price of keeping 18 men alive against 120. The battlefield itself was reclaimed by Forrest decades ago, absorbed back into the landscape as if that night had never happened. The foxholes Hollister's men dug have long since filled in with decades of falling leaves and erosion. The kill zone where German soldiers died screaming has been overgrown with new trees that have no memory of what fertilized their roots. The only physical marker of what happened there is a small bronze plaque placed by a Belgian historical society in 1995 on the ridgeline where Hollister's command post had been. It reads simply, "Here American soldiers defended against German breakthrough, December 1944. There is no mention of numbers, no reference to tactics or methods, no names listed of who lived or died. The battle has been absorbed into the vast catalog of small engagements that made up the larger campaign, remembered in general terms but forgotten in particular detail. Only those who were there, and those who read Hollister's interview years later, understand what that plaque represents: a night when mathematics failed, deception succeeded." And a young teacher from Pennsylvania discovered that the cost of victory could include the permanent loss of certainty about whether that victory was worth its moral price. Years after the war, in 1973, one of Hollister's former students who had gone on to become a teacher himself came back to visit and asked him a question over coffee in the high school cafeteria where they had both spent so much of their lives. The former student asked what Hollister had learned from his combat experience that he brought back to teaching mathematics, expecting perhaps a story about discipline or perseverance or the importance of following procedures. Hollister thought for a long moment, staring out the window at students crossing the lawn, the spring sunshine, then gave an answer that surprised and slightly disturbed his former student. He said he had learned that there are problems with multiple solutions, and sometimes the right answer depends less on the formula you use than on what you are willing to sacrifice to reach the result. In mathematics, he explained, 2 plus 2 always equals 4. The Pythagorean theorem always holds for right triangles, and the laws of algebra are universal and unchanging. But in life the variables are never that clean, the equations are never that simple, and sometimes the answer you get is not the one you wanted but the one you could live with. It was as close as he ever came in a public conversation to articulating the lesson of December 18th, the night when 18 men held a line against 120, and the victory was written in deception, concentrated fire, and a lie told over a radio that saved lives at the cost of one man's peace of mind for the next 57 years. The legacy of that night lives on not in monuments or medals gathering dust in display cases, but in the quiet knowledge among military professionals who study small unit combat that sometimes survival requires more than courage and superior firepower. It requires the willingness to think beyond doctrine and established procedures, to exploit enemy psychology and expectations, to take calculated risks that might cost you everything, including your reputation and peace of mind, and to accept that the difference between a hero celebrated in official reports and a war criminal prosecuted for violations can be measured in meters of artillery adjustment and the subjective judgments of men who were not there when the decisions had to be made. Hollister understood this in a way that few of his generation ever articulated publicly, and his willingness to speak about it in the final years of his life, when he had nothing left to lose and no one left to protect, preserved a truth that would otherwise have died with him, that war is not won solely by the brave or the strong or the technologically superior, but by those capable of making impossible choices in impossible circumstances and living with the consequences long after the shooting stops and the parades end and the medals are put away in boxes. In 2006, 5 years after Hollister's death, the surviving members of his platoon, who could be located, were invited to a small ceremony at the Army Historical Foundation in Virginia where a display was being created about small unit actions during the Battle of the Bulge. 7 men attended, all of them in their 80s, some in wheelchairs, all carrying the weight of decades. They gathered around a map that showed the position they had held that night, and for the first time in 62 years they talked openly about what had happened. Staff Sergeant Dietrich, who was 90 years old and had survived throat cancer and to heart attacks, spoke about how he had wrestled for decades with conflicting feelings about Hollister's leadership that night. He said he had been angry initially about the deception, feeling manipulated and lied to, but over time he had come to understand that Hollister had carried the moral burden alone so that his men did not have to. The lieutenant had made the hard decisions, told the necessary lies, and accepted the consequences without spreading the guilt to those who had simply followed orders. That, Dietrich said quietly, was a kind of leadership that deserved recognition even if it could never be officially celebrated. Private First Class Kowalski, the farm kid from Iowa who had simulated an entire rifle squad with his carefully timed shots, spoke about how that night had taught him something about himself that he had never forgotten, that he was capable of functioning under impossible pressure, that his mind could stay clear when death was seconds away, and that the training and trust in his leaders had carried him through when his own courage faltered. He had gone back to farming after the war, never spoke about his service except in the vaguest terms, and raised 5 children who knew their father had been in the war but had no idea what he had done or endured. But he said he thought about that night every December 18th for 62 years, remembering the weight of the rifle in his hands and the sound of his own shots echoing across the frozen valley and the knowledge that he was part of something that should have failed but somehow succeeded. He wished, he said, that he had told Hollister before the lieutenant died that he understood why those decisions had been necessary, and that he did not blame him for any of it. Several of the other veterans nodded in agreement, and there was a moment of silence that felt like a kind of absolution for a man who was no longer alive to receive it. The museum display that resulted from that gathering included the map, photographs of the men, and a carefully worded description of the engagement that mentioned tactical innovation and deception techniques without going into specifics about the artillery coordinates or the lies told to higher command. Next to the display was a photograph of Hollister taken in 1945, showing a young man with old eyes who looked directly at the camera with an expression that seemed to contain both pride and profound sadness. Below the photograph was a quote from his oral history interview. "We held the line because there was no alternative, and we used every tool available, including deception, because in war the only unforgivable sin is failing when success was possible. I have lived with those decisions for 54 years, and I would make them again, and that knowledge is both the heaviest and the most necessary burden I carry." It was a quote that captured something fundamental about the nature of combat leadership that few people outside the military ever understand. That the men and women who make life and death decisions under impossible pressure often carry the moral weight of those decisions for the rest of their lives, even when the decisions were tactically correct and strategically necessary. The ethical questions raised by Hollister's actions that night continue to be debated in military ethics courses and leadership seminars more than 80 years after the battle. Is deception of the enemy morally equivalent to deception of your own command? Does the successful outcome justify the violation of regulations designed to prevent friendly fire casualties? Can a leader who lies to achieve tactical success still be considered honorable? Where is the line between tactical flexibility and criminal deception, and who gets to draw that line? These questions have no universally accepted answers, because they touch on fundamental tensions between results and methods, between effectiveness and integrity, between individual lives and institutional trust. What is clear from studying Hollister's case is that he understood the moral complexity of what he had done, that he never tried to justify it with easy rationalizations or claims that the ends always justify the means, and that he carried the burden of those decisions with the kind of honest self-examination that is perhaps the best indicator of moral seriousness. He did not celebrate what he had done or claim it was heroic. He simply acknowledged that it was necessary, and that necessity in war often requires compromises that would be unacceptable in any other context. In the final analysis, the story of December 18, 1944, is not primarily about tactics or weapons or terrain, though all of those played crucial. It is a story about the burden of command, about what happens when you are responsible for other people's lives and the only options available are bad and worse. It is about the gap between the clean certainty of peacetime ethics and the terrible ambiguities of combat decision-making, where every choice carries costs that cannot be fully calculated in advance. It is about the difference between the official history that gets recorded in after-action reports and the human reality that gets carried in memory and nightmares. And it is ultimately about the question that haunted James Edward Hollister for 57 years after that frozen night in Belgium. When you save lives through deception and calculated dishonesty, when you keep your promises by violating principles you were taught to hold sacred, when you win by methods you cannot fully defend in moral terms, what exactly have you won and what have you lost? Hollister never found a satisfying answer to that question, and perhaps there is no satisfying answer to be found, only the recognition that war forces people to make choices that cannot be judged by peacetime standards and must instead be evaluated by the impossible standard of whether there was any better option available in that moment with that information and those stakes. The 18 men who held that line are mostly gone now, claimed by time and age and the inevitable mortality that awaits even those who survive impossible odds. Their names are listed in the division history and on memorial walls and in databases of veterans who served. Most of them lived quiet lives after the war, returned to families and jobs and communities that had no frame of reference for what they had experienced. They carried their memories privately, sharing them rarely and only with others who had been there or who had experienced similar trials in other battles. But their story, preserved in Hollister's oral history and in the after-action reports and in the memories of the few who remain, stands as a testament to what is possible when ordinary men face extraordinary circumstances with courage, creativity, and a willingness to accept moral complexity as the price of survival. They held a line that doctrine said could not be held, defeated an enemy that mathematics said they could not defeat, and survived a night that probability said they should not survive. And they did it not through conventional tactics or superior equipment or overwhelming force, but through deception, psychological manipulation, and the calculated exploitation of enemy expectations by a leader willing to shoulder the moral burden of methods that could never be officially acknowledged or celebrated. That is the legacy of December 18, 1944. Not a clean story of heroism and triumph, but a complicated truth about war and leadership and the compromises that survival sometimes demands. It is a story that deserves to be remembered not because it makes us feel good about what people are capable of achieving, but because it forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that what people achieve in war often comes at costs that cannot be measured in casualties alone. James Edward Hollister kept his promise to bring his men home alive, and that promise cost him 57 years of wrestling with the question of whether the methods he used to keep it were justified by the outcome. He never reached a conclusion that satisfied him, and perhaps that uncertainty, that refusal to embrace easy certainty about moral complexity, is the most honest and most important part of his legacy. If this story moved you, help keep these forgotten World War II skies alive by liking this video, sharing it with a friend who loves history, and subscribing so you don't miss the next untold mission.